In this module, we're going to be focusing on the Hund et al. Reading, talking about what social movements are and aren't, some characteristics and types of social movements, and also through the lens of looking at three specific examples, actually probably four examples of social movements as we're going over these sociological concepts. So the definition for social movements is pretty variable. It's really hard to say what is and what isn't a social movement before we give it the definition or description of being a social movement. And that's because there's no set way that a social movement forms. Sometimes they're top down, sometimes they're bottom up as far as leadership or organizational structure. But what we do know is that social movements are purposeful, that typically they either are organized or they become organized groups that strive to work towards a common social goal. And so we learn a lot about social movements in our history classes, but we also tend to take them for granted. We tend to view social movements as having been like some exemplary group of people, or, just like some alignment of the right time in the right place, or just like, everyone in society was already on the right side of history, and so they just needed a nudge in the right direction. But social movements can actually be quite revolutionary. They can go against the grain. Sometimes it's just a small group of people that are able to amplify their voices to be heard. And so don't assume that, social movements occur without some sort of antagonist or some sort of catalyst. Um, Sometimes people, after the fact, they kind of review themselves with a revisionist history, believing that we were headed in that direction anyway. Um, and one of the things that in particular might be a bit of a change or a challenge that we do recognize is that there's now a trend towards global social movements. So this was exemplified with the BLM movement in the summer of 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. This was exemplified more recently with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and also with the horrific situation in Palestine and Israel right now. And we're seeing that, as a result of us becoming more of a globalized world, we're starting to see that it doesn't take long and it doesn't take much to spark a global social movement. So, and some of these movements can be very small, um, and become huge, and some can be really big in the beginning, and then they dwindle as far as our interest, and as far as our attention span regarding those things. So we're going to talk about these characteristics of social movements. So, for example, the scope, the types of change, the targets, like who is the movement trying to get to act, whose interest is the movement trying to kind of stoke, the methods of work, how they go about it. Does it involve lots of protests and demonstrations? Does it involve going through legal means? Or does it involve like staging a coup? What's happening? And then we'll also talk about the range of the social movement as well. When it comes to types of social movement, we typically talk about four, and you have a really good chart in your text that kind of outlines these. So we start with alternative movements, which are usually very much an individual focused movement. So usually they're looking at limited specific changes to individual beliefs, individual behaviors. And so it might be something like encouraging people to participate in transcendental meditation, or encouraging people to take on a macrobiotic diet. These are movements where we're not trying to change an entire society, but instead just the behaviors of those who are interested. With a redemptive movement, these are typically focused on a segment of society, And usually they're trying to create some sort of growth or interchange. So some examples that you get here are some sects. So like Heaven's Gate, I would call these sects actually cults, the ones that they give as examples. Um, so Heaven's Gate, I'm trying to think of another one. The Branch Davidians, right? Where it's meaning seeking. They're trying to provoke some sort of spiritual growth and things like that. Then there's reformative social movements, which are actually trying to change something specific about the social structure. So it might be something that's really specific and limited as far as the change is concerned, but the population is the like entire population, right? Instead of being just a specific segment of the population, like the alternative and redemptive movement. Sorry, something's in my eye. They're targeting the entire population. So you'll see this with environmental movements, like your text post points out, um, and also some examples in looking at like dreamers and other reformative movements that are trying to like reform some policy or reform some sort of change that, while it may directly impact like a certain segment of people, it will still be a decision for all of that society. And then finally, we have revolutionary movements, which are exactly what they say they are. They're trying to completely change every aspect of society. So it's really dramatic. It's changing perhaps like an entire social institution or how we view an entire group of people and what rights they have and things like that. And so the examples you get in your text are really good ones. So, like, for example, if you're trying to overthrow capitalism or pushing for communism, or looking at some political movements like the civil rights movement, of course, and things like that. So going back into those categories, when it comes to the characteristics of movements, I think I already talked about targets, right? Who are they focusing on? Is it specific individuals, or is it groups, or is it society altogether? With methods of work, I talked about like, is it going to be protest? Is it going to be demonstration? You could also be looking at whether or not it's going to be peaceful, if there's going to be civil unrest. And then when we're talking about the range of movements, now we're looking at whether a movement is meant to be local or regional, or is it going to be a global movement? Is it transnational or international in its, in its range? Two other things to mention here are the scope of a movement, whether it's going to be reformative or radical, whether you're just trying to change something, or if you want to have a huge movement that's going to really deeply alter society. And then also the type of change, right? Is it going to be innovative change? Is it going to be something that's going to be adding new elements to a society, to our values, to our norms? Or is it a conservative change where you're just trying to preserve something that already exists, right? Um, so, for example, if you're trying to fight against like GMOs, or if you're trying to, fight against changing some sort of power structure that has already been in existence. So, yeah, these are some of the ways that we describe social movements. So throughout the rest of this reading, the authors mention different social movements, and they use those social movements to introduce some other concepts, and do case study analyses um, on those different parts, or characteristics of a social movement. And so they're going to talk about immigrant rights and looking in particular at dreamers. They're going to talk about Black Lives Matter, as well, or BLM. They're going to talk about indigenous sovereignty, and in particular, they're going to be looking at the connection between indigenous sovereignty and environmental justice. And then they're going to be looking at white nationalism also, as a type of social movement. And so, as you go through each of these, I want you to think about the characteristics and types that we talked about on the previous slide and how they apply. What does the scope look like? What is the range like? And so on. And is it a redemptive movement? Is it a reformative or a revolutionary movement? So think about those things and try to actually practice applying those characteristics and types to the social movements that are discussed in this module.